Joaquin Phoenix is an unforgettable on-screen Napoleon Bonaparte, but Ridley Scott's film doesn't tell the whole story. From political cartoons to thorough medical details, here's what the film left out. Napoleon Bonaparte lived a life that was almost too big for cinematic adaptation, but that hasn't stopped ambitious filmmakers from trying. The first attempt was a short in 1909 called Napoleon and the Empress Josephine. Since then, there have been rather comprehensive efforts, like the 5.5-hour silent film Napoleon from 1927. Other attempts have been more narrowly focused, like 1970's Waterloo. The latest entry, directed by Ridley Scott, attempts to split the difference. It's not a birth-to-death biopic, but it certainly covers much more than a single battle. It plays like an action-packed, politically intriguing comic highlight reel that jumps between battlefields, ballrooms, and bedrooms. In so doing, Napoleon leaves out not only years' worth of history, but also some important context for the sake of dramatization. Napoleon opens with a scene in which the title character lurks in the crowd as Marie Antoinette is paraded on her way to the guillotine. As citizens scream and throw rotten tomatoes at her, the deposed queen remains defiant. She's styled in a tight-fitting dark dress with multiple layers of blonde hair cascading from her head. Marie Antoinette's beheading was a significant chapter in the French Revolution. However, Napoleon doesn't explain the circumstances that led to her death sentence, nor does it depict her final moments as they truly happened. The real Marie Antoinette was a broken woman by that fateful day, having been widowed by her husband's execution, imprisoned with her children, and eventually separated from her son. She was wrongly and humiliatingly accused of incest at her trial. The stress took a toll on her appearance. She was gaunt, her hair had turned white and been cut short, and she wore a modest white dress and cap. Marie also wrote a final letter expressing regret that her children would be left without a mother. Before the blade fell, she even apologized to the executioner for stepping on his foot. Also, Napoleon wasn't in attendance, as he would have already been occupied with the siege of Toulon. The promotional materials for Napoleon portray the man as someone who used wit and war to come from nothing and conquer everything. In the first act, he wears relatively dirty clothes compared to the other men who are rising within the ranks of the newly Republican-leaning French military. This framework certainly makes Napoleon's ascension to power more dramatic, but it's only partly accurate.
What would you do if this assignment of defense was transferred to you?
Frank McLinn's 1997 book, Napoleon, a Biography, delves into his ancestry and early life. His family was Corsican nobility. His father Carlo had studied law, while his mother Letizia had a dowry. While familial titles were more common in Italy and didn't necessarily come with much power or wealth, Napoleon was born with distinct advantages that directly led to his success. Because of his family's minor nobility, he was able to attend high-quality schools, especially once the French were in control of his native island. As played by Vanessa Kirby, Josephine enters Napoleon's life in the movie after she's released from prison following the end of the Reign of Terror. They meet each other at an event known as a survivor's ball. Josephine's hair is still shorn from her captivity, and she's dressed as if she's a courtesan. But Napoleon can't stop staring. Shortly thereafter, a boy confronts him about his late father's ancestral sword. Napoleon then personally delivers the sword to what turns out to be Josephine's home.
Josephine's story is mind-blowing, really.
The film leaves out the detail that Napoleon already had a fiancée at the time. He was engaged to Desiree Clary, the sister of his brother Joseph's wife, Julie. Also, there's no record of Napoleon meeting Josephine at a survivor's ball. However, there was a lingering story in the public imagination regarding the business with the sword, and it went almost exactly as their second meet-cute happens in the film. Josephine thanks Napoleon for his kindness, and they become lovers. This version of events made for a better story, but it's probably apocryphal. Napoleon and Josephine were in the same social circles and were almost certainly familiar with each other. As his reputation became more established, and considering that she was an aging widow and mother with few resources, her attention turned from the politician Paul Barras to Napoleon. After marrying Josephine, Napoleon leaves to invade Egypt. In the film, his forces can be seen firing on the pyramids of Giza and the Great Sphinx. Then he leaves in a huff upon hearing that Josephine is having an affair with a man named Hippolyte Charles. Napoleon did invade Egypt, and Josephine did have an affair with Hippolyte Charles, but this sequence plays fast and loose with the facts. The real Napoleon waged war in Egypt to improve France's trade prospects and to interfere with Britain's. He also imagined himself as an Alexander the Great-esque figure who could bring Western ideals to the Middle East. But the Battle of the Pyramids pyramids took place in Mbaba, a city near Giza, and his men aren't responsible for knocking the nose off of the Sphinx or causing damage to the pyramids. Furthermore, Napoleon didn't leave Egypt because of Josephine's infidelity. According to Frank McLynn, he was losing ground and cut off from intelligence, and he realized that his political future depended on being back in France. It's also worth noting that his time in Egypt led to the discovery of the Rosetta Stone and the construction of the modern Suez Canal. Throughout the film, there are glimpses of unfavorable newspaper coverage in which Napoleon is called names like Boney and drawn as an unflattering caricature. While the real Napoleon did endure this sort of ridicule, it didn't come at the pens of French journalists. In fact, one of his strengths was his use of propaganda to bolster his own image and attack his adversaries. According to Napoleon, a biography, he relied on 2 newspapers that he distributed to soldiers to spin his mistakes and embellish his accomplishments.
What's the outcome of this if you don't succeed?
Those humiliating headlines would have been written and run in England, not France. It was the British who intercepted the letters that he exchanged with Josephine during their time apart. The Brits had a vested interest in belittling the French leader. The very idea of the Napoleon complex comes from British political cartoons. They focused on a characterization of Napoleon as tiny and temperamental. The image stuck, even though at 5 feet 7 inches, he was actually taller than the average man of the era. After Napoleon makes the difficult decision to divorce Josephine, he urgently searches for a younger and more fertile bride of noble birth. He strikes out with the sister of Tsar Alexander, but the Austrians are willing to hand over Archduchess Marie-Louise, ostensibly to bolster their alliance with France. She arrives at court and tells an awkward Napoleon that he's even more handsome than his portrait. Soon thereafter, she's already given birth to his first legitimate heir. Marie-Louise was indeed Napoleon's second wife, and she bore him a son within the first year of their marriage. Their marriage was a political calculation, but a clumsy one at best in the eyes of French citizens, and Marie-Louise wasn't nearly so smitten with her husband upon first glance. According to Frank McLynn, Napoleon believed that the marriage would improve his standing with the rest of the European royals, but it didn't. He also thought that the issue of an heir would pacify the French public. Instead, it was unpopular among those with revolution on their minds. Marie-Louise had also been raised to hate Napoleon, as their countries had been enemies for most of her childhood. Though she resolved herself to do her duty, she was terrified by the prospect. During one of Napoleon's efforts in the film to seize political power, a brawl breaks out. He escapes through a door and indicates to the people in the town square that an attempt has been made on his life. In truth, he survived several assassination plots, which is one of the ways that the movie undersells the high stakes of his rule. But viewers may eventually get to see another similar scene in a director's cut. Vanessa Kirby told USA Today that a sequence involving Josephine's imprisonment and another involving an assassination attempt were edited out of the theatrical cut. During Napoleon's tenure as first consul, there was a plot to poison him at one of his homes and a plot to stab him to death while he was attending the opera. But the most serious attempt on his life came on Christmas Eve in 1800 when royalist conspirators planted an explosive device in a cart that was part of Napoleon and Josephine's procession of carriages. They escaped unharmed, but 52 other people died in the blast zone, and there may well have been additional schemes once he ascended to the throne.
Whose country are we in?
In the film, Napoleon is banished a couple of times, first to the island of Elba near Italy. This sequence gets just a few minutes of screen time as a still righteous Napoleon parades through the narrow streets on horseback. He eventually mounts a return to France in which he's able to win some soldiers over to his side. However, when he arrives, he's devastated to learn from Josephine's daughter that the love of his life has passed away.
You are nothing without me.
In real life, Napoleon learned about Josephine's death in the press while he was still in exile. He did still visit the residence Malmaison, where he mourned his ex-wife by gathering violets that he kept in a locket for the rest of his life. But Napoleon's life almost ended on Elba. In Napoleon, a biography, it's proposed that he contemplated suicide and tried to poison himself on at least 2 occasions. Though specifics can't be proven, reliable sources from the time claimed that he kept suicide pills in a small black pouch that he wore around his neck in the event that death should become the preferable course of action. Napoleon is, to put it mildly, a complicated historical figure. On one hand, as the film makes clear in a closing title card, he's responsible for the deaths of about 3 million people. The movie also depicts him as someone who has problematic relationships with women and an inability to admit his faults. He's also seen in a positive light, as he succeeds in love, politics, and war more often than not. Still, the plot also skips over a great many of his civic and cultural accomplishments, perhaps because they don't make for compelling cinema. The real Napoleon was notably responsible for the creation of a French bank, stock market, and tax regulations, all of which measurably improved the prospects of the economic lower classes. He also oversaw public works projects like roads, bridges, ports, and public buildings. He sought to protect religious liberty for Catholics, Protestants, and Jews, and he updated and secularized the legal system to be more egalitarian. He encouraged enlightened thinking and recognized the leading scientists and artists of the day. He also expanded the French school system, and he sold the Louisiana Purchase to the United States. The movie comes to an abrupt end when Napoleon keels over in his chair after hallucinating that he can hear Josephine beckoning him to the other side. A title card explains that he died about 6 years into his time in exile on St. Helena, a remote piece of land in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. No cause of death is mentioned. In real life, the mysterious circumstances surrounding Napoleon's death have been the subject of fascinating debate. He became ill shortly after arriving in St. Helena. His symptoms included pain, insomnia, lethargy, bowel problems, rashes, and probably gout. The damp conditions may have made things worse, but the severity and pace of his decline indicated that something else was wrong. The culprit may have been hepatitis or stomach cancer, the latter of which had killed his father. Nevertheless, rumors persist that Napoleon was poisoned, either intentionally or accidentally, or that he poisoned himself, perhaps with arsenic. There's some evidence that supports these theories, considering that he'd been the subject of assassination plots and may have also attempted suicide. It's also possible that he was affected by arsenic in the wallpaper in his home. Also left out of the film is the bizarre fact that his penis was allegedly removed during his autopsy.